Hello everyone, my name is John Bristowe, and I'd like to thank you for all taking the time to join me here today to talk to you guys about Kendo UI and the Angular directives that we have built for Kendo UI to make your development a little bit easier. So for the next few minutes we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, if you haven't heard about Telerik, this is who we are. This is telerik.com. You can go check us out. We've been in the industry for a while. We've been building UI controls for well over a decade, traditionally in the .NET space, but we also build controls for iOS, Android. We target hybrid mobile. We have a product called Telerik Platform. We have a CMS called Sitefinity. We have agile management tools. We also have testing tools, a whole bunch of other things, so check it out. Today we're talking about Kendo UI and Angular. If you haven't heard about Kendo UI is a web development framework designed to make your life a little bit easier by basically saving you some time in terms of UI aspects on your page. So Kendo UI provides over 70 controls that you can use. These range from simple controls like autocomplete, date pickers, things like that, to really complicated controls like grids, schedulers, and so forth. And the win there is that they're all built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They load inside of what's called they load within the context of your page. They're directed and targeted using jQuery and selectors and things like that. And we'll take a look at how that all works. But really they're there because they're based on standards. They work well across browsers, and they save you a lot of time in your development. In terms of today's talk, we're going to focus a little bit on how to target Kendo UI using the Angular directives that we have built. So for those who don't know, Angular is a framework that you can use to help build out web applications. Supports everything from models and controllers and bindings and things of that nature. They have these things called directives, which are basically a way of annotating DOM elements, like elements and attributes and things like that, to basically drive plumbing. And so what we're going to be taking a look at here is how we have a set of what are called custom directives. Those are little things that you can sprinkle in your markup that make Kendo UI work in that Angular context. So that means you can combine Kendo UI with your Angular controllers, your models, etc. And so you have this sort of best of all worlds. If you need to find out more about that, you can go check out our repo, which is up on Kendo Labs. There's a repository there. That's the Angular bindings that we have for our Kendo UI widgets. That's listed off of our website as well. We do have a bunch of documentation and demos that we'll talk about as well. And if you need to kind of have a walkthrough, we have a walkthrough that will show you how to get this up and running using Kendo UI with Angular. So that's what we're going to be covering today. But first, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about Kendo UI. Adam and others have told me you guys are using Kendo UI as part of your UI layer. Is that correct? Yes? Okay, so I'm getting some head nods for those watching the video. So as I said before, Kendo UI is over 70 based widgets. Kendo UI is 70 plus jQuery based widgets. These range from simple to more complicated scenarios for building out web apps. You can take a look at the demos yourself. I'll just show you some of the widgets we have. When you go to this page, you'll see that it's broken up into areas of concern. So we have everything from like editor type widgets to charts and graphs to scheduling to navigation, etc. The other thing worth mentioning is that a large chunk of Kendo UI is open source and available up on GitHub. So there's a distribution we provide called Kendo UI Core, which if you just go ahead and Google for, you'll find Kendo UI Core listed here. There's our GitHub repo there. This includes a large chunk of Kendo UI itself. So this includes most of Kendo UI Web, all of the framework for Kendo UI, and other elements as well. So definitely worth taking a look at. Kendo UI itself loads as a jQuery plugin. And if you have any experience with jQuery or that sort of mechanism of referencing elements and working against them and the sort of declarative model and configuration, things like that, this should feel pretty natural. But getting back to the widgets, we have everything from simple widgets for things like auto-completion. So for example, I can go to an autocomplete here and start typing something. You can see we get this nice drop-down menu. Everything from that to other widgets, including things like date time pickers. So date time picker is a pretty common one. Because of the res here, it's going to be a little bit tricky for me to demo some of these things. But date time picker just basically targets an input element and provides this mechanism of selecting a date and a time. That's also localizable, so we support multiple cultures, multiple languages, that sort of thing. So that's something that you can use as well. So simple ones like that to more complicated ones, which we like to classify as like more like solutions. They're not individual widgets, but they're rather a pretty big solution that you can use within the confines of your application. So for example, a grid. This is sort of like the canonical layman, poor man's solution to showing a lot of data on one page, right? So with grids, you have this sort of layout table structure that supports a variety of operations. So you support filtering, paging, sorting, all sorts of things. And you can see examples of those here. We've recently added features like exporting to Excel, exporting to PDF, working with various protocols like WebSockets, etc. So we'll take a look at some of that as we go through this. All the widgets that you see listed here are integrated with Angular. So you can actually utilize Angular as part of your development process if you wish. But before we get started, what I'd like to show you is just how easy it is to actually get one of these widgets up and running on your page. So one of the design goals we had for Kendo UI is to try and eliminate as many dependencies as possible. So if anyone has done a lot of web dev in the past, you may notice that when you start getting going, you know, at first you may have a couple of references to external JS libraries and such. But as your project grows and grows, you start taking more dependencies, and then if you decide to update one of them, the entire thing can kind of tumble down like a deck of cards. So with Kendo UI, one of our design goals is to try to eliminate a lot of those dependencies. And so we try to provide everything out of the box so that you don't have to take a lot of dependencies on different libraries. That stated, Angular is a good example of this. We do support other frameworks as well. We play well with others. So Knockout's another example. Any number of frameworks that are out there, you know, we play well. Bootstrap is another example. So those are things that you can do. But just to kind of lay the land, you know, I'll just show you how an element like an autocomplete might be defined. So in this, I have an input element or a div tag or some kind of DOM element that I want to target for being a autocomplete. This is underpinned with data, so you'll notice that this list is coming from some data somewhere. It can be local data, it can be remote data, it really doesn't matter. And we have some interaction that occurs here. We have events, things like that. So the way that we'll initialize this is, first off, we have to include some references. So out of the box, Kendo UI includes some style sheets. Don't worry about what they are right now, I'll explain that later. And also two dependencies, one on jQuery and then one on Kendo. This one that you see here, which is kendo.all.min.js, is basically the entire kitchen sink. This is everything and anything and everything that we ship as part of Kendo. But you don't have to do that. You can actually minimize the amount of dependency that you take on Kendo as a whole. From there, we then have an input tag. So notice that this is just a bare bones input tag with an ID on it called countries. There's no list of options here. You know, this is just basically an empty element. Where this gets initialized and turned into an autocomplete is on document ready, which is this event handler here in jQuery. So jQuery provides this mechanism of defining a callback for the ready event. And inside here, we go ahead and construct our array of countries. So this is just a simple array declaration. And then later on, when we want to initialize the autocomplete, we do so simply by grabbing a reference to that element through a selector. So that's just selecting the ID that matches countries, and then calling an API called Kendo Autocomplete. So this is basically how we turn that basic input element into an autocomplete. There's some configuration properties that we define here. The most important one to understand is this one here. So underpinning every Kendo UI control is this thing called a data source. If you've done any work with .NET, it's sort of akin to a data set in a sense. It's basically either an in-memory or remote structure of data that you can bind to a control. And so when you do this, what it's saying is we have some data somewhere defined as data, and we're going to go ahead and bind this control called an autocomplete to it. Once it does that, it is able to work out, you know, what are the entries, etc. But the data source itself is a pretty important part of Kendo UI, and actually, as you'll see later on, has facilities for doing remote bindings and all kinds of interesting work with other transports like WebSockets, etc. So with that done, that's basically how you turn a basic bare bones element like an input tag into something like an autocomplete. The same can also be applied for more complicated ones, like for example the editor. So the editor is usually one that you'll use if you want to have some rich WYSIWYG functionality. So if you want to, say, have some bold in your text and underline, et cetera, et cetera. All this just basically gets encoded in the markup itself. This is a container that wraps a text area tag and then adds this functionality in this menu bar here. The way that this gets initialized, just to show you, is we have a text editor here. And this text editor is pre-initialized with encoded HTML. So this is the markup that you saw in the editor itself. But the way that we initialize it is no different than, say, we initialize the autocomplete. We grab a reference to that through a selector, and then we initialize the editor by calling Kendo Editor. That's the basic usage model of Kendo UI. So that's without Angular. That's just basically like just using plain vanilla JS with, obviously, our framework, and that's how you go. Any questions on that so far? Have you guys done anything with Kendo yet? No? Okay. Have you guys done any UI work at all? The answer to that question, by the way, is no. So I'm just for obviously the video purposes. Have you guys worked with any UI frameworks yet, or are you just doing vanilla HTML right now?
Vanilla HTML.
Okay. Okay. So the answer is vanilla HTML. That's fine. So as Adam alluded to prior to we started recording, one of the reasons why you use UI frameworks is to save time, to be more effective and efficient. And the reason why is because there are a lot of nuances and gotchas with older browsers or with other aspects like right to left versus left to right or accessibility or all those things. All those things are built into Kendo UI. So we support ARIA attributes, we support right to left, left to right, we have different cultures, we have broad browser support, all the stuff that you would normally have to do yourself to fix those things for IE7 or Chrome whatever or Firefox whatever. Those things we actually support. And so that's why you use a UI framework like Kendo UI or others. Now, targeting this with Angular turns out to be pretty simple. In fact, all the demos that we have posted on our website include an Angular demo. So showing that same example, in this case with the editor, the way this is done is with a set of attributes as well. So looking at the definition here, you guys have done some work with Angular as well? Yes? What have you guys, just for my purpose, sorry for the folks watching the video, for my purpose, what have you guys done with Angular so far? You guys have done models, controllers, factories, okay, bindings, yeah. So you guys are pretty comfortable with Angular so far? Yeah. Getting there? Okay, all right. So the response is yes. I think these guys are all experts, which is great. So the way in which you target Kendo UI via Angular is not too dissimilar to the way you do it with just vanilla Angular today. So here's our declaration of ng app. We have our controller defined here as well. And then we can decorate through directives the various elements that we have on our page to drive the plumbing. So a custom directive that we have here, which is called Kendo Editor, is a custom directive we've defined for Kendo UI that turns that same text area you saw before into a editor control. So previously what you saw was we used the old school jQuery $select.api call in JavaScript. This way, the way that the compilation process works inside of Angular, it's going to spot that directive, know that I have to go ahead and reconcile that against the directive, and then it magically just works, right? There's a lot of stuff that happens underneath the covers with directives, but the good news is you don't really have to worry about that too much. So Kendo Editor is the directive here. We can then bind to a model if we so wish. So we have a model here, and we can go ahead and bind that. The way in which the initialization is done within script is no dissimilar to what you may have done previously with Angular. So we list our dependencies within our array. We have this one here for our custom directives called kendo.directives. This one is listed within the kendo.all reference. But you must include Angular as well, obviously, to get the Angular plumbing to work. But you'll notice that the difference between the script directives from the previous example is we've just simply added Angular. So those directives already live in the sort of kitchen sink build of Kendo, which is that all.js file. And once you have that, then you can go from there to initializing in your scope, for example, various models like an HTML model that we have defined previously. And that's about it. That's how you drive that plumbing relative to Kendo. It's pretty simple. And that's kind of the idea with the directives that you'll find in Kendo, is that The intention there is not to complicate matters. It's meant to naturally integrate within the sort of customs that you'll find within Angular itself. So I showed you previously the grid. I apologize again for the resolution. This is good for folks looking at it without having to zoom in, but it's hard for me because I have to drive all this. So the grid here itself, you're seeing an example here of details that are driven by the row. So typically in a grid, like a table like this, you'll just see the table itself. This one has a parent-child relationship defined within the data source. And inside the child, we're able to customize through what's called a row template the look and feel. So I can change this to use what's called a tab strip. This is a tab strip control here. And I can go ahead and change the look and feel of that. The reason why this looks so bad is because I've changed the theme. Let me change to a more friendly theme for the eyes. There's one called Material Design. This is the new Google Material Design theme that we ship out of the box. I forgot to mention, though, that we ship a bunch of themes out of the box. So there's ones called by name like Default, Silver, Uniform. Those are color schemes. And then we have ones that are compatible with other schemes like Material, which is more aligned to Google's Material Design. We have Metro, which obviously aligns to Microsoft's Metro UI. We also have integration with Bootstrap as well. We have a Bootstrap theme if you're into that sort of thing. So here's the grid. This is a row template here using a tab strip. And then inside here I have another subgrid that uses paging. This is an example of paging. I can do sorting as well by clicking on the column. You can see how that works there. Make sense? So using this with Angular, scrolling down to the markup here, you can see we have the same sort of dependencies we had before. We declare our app, declare our controller, and then from there we have a custom directive. This is where we can define our grid. So we have Kendo Grid as the custom directive. We have a key value pair or attribute value pair called options. So before, when I showed you the autocomplete, you may notice I had all those sort of data source equals data source colon data, and then filter equals string, and it was like just basically a definition for defining my what's called configuration. Those options are defined within this model here. So we're defining just basically an object literal, and we're passing that object literal to this definition here with the directive. So in order to configure the grid, that's how we do that. So this, you may wonder, like, where is main grid options coming from? It's defined here within the scope. So that's this object literal here. Within here, we can define our sub-elements. So we've put in here another element called a tab strip. So that's the child or detail, what's called a detail template. I think of it as a child, or you can think of it as any way you want, just the way you're describing it. So inside of our detail template, which is a sort of aspect of the grid for Kendo UI, we have this what's called detail template. By marking the div element here with this attribute, we can then specify here's what the template looks like. The template itself is basically like, what do I need to render in order to display this sort of sub element within each row? And inside here we define a tab strip, which is basically broken up into 3 root elements. The first thing we have is our top element UI. We then have a div, and then we have another div. So the way you have to think of a tab strip within markup is your UI, UL, is basically broke up of 2 tabs, orders and contact information. So if we scroll up, sorry again, this is hard to drive. There's orders and contact information. So the first element, and this is more by convention, right? Like we'll list this in the docs, but by convention, this is what we expect. So you're going to have these are your tabs up here, and I could easily add more if I wanted to. Then from here, by convention, we say, okay, if you have 2 LIs, you're going to have 2 subdivs. The first div is obviously going to be your orders, and then the second div is obviously going to be your contact information. From there, we can then do standard sort of vanilla model binding that you would typically see in an Angular application. So here what we're doing is we're saying, use within the context, there's something called a data item. We're going to go ahead and bind to the country of that entity to display the country for that particular detail. So country, city. You can also use the double mustache notation, obviously. So that's a way of actually resolving those bindings. Have you guys seen this before? Some saying. Okay. So it's just different representations of ways of doing binding effectively. So the double mustache is one notation. It's a common notation you'll see in other templating sort of frameworks as well. I know Google is big fans of this as well. So there's other ways to bind to these things as well. And then from there, we've defined our options. The options that you see here, you don't have to understand just yet. I've kind of explained and hand waved around them. That's typically how software development is work. Is like something happens, a miracle occurs, and then you have this control on your page. So this is the miracle that occurs down here. As you read through the docs, don't worry, it will become more and more understandable. Like any framework, most of the time is not spent understanding like what actual controls you're using, but rather getting the control to do what you want. Any framework is like that, whether it's .NET, whether it's Angular, whether it's anything. So yeah, that's where you spend most of your time is in the docs. So that's basically the way that these things kind of integrate from a high level. We have a doc that you can take a look at here where we walk you step by step how to actually get all the plumbing up and running. So for example, we talk about what dependencies you need to include, and then if you scroll down you can see how we are able to create or initialize widgets using an Angular notation, which is the sort of the dash delimited sort of mechanism. So we have this mechanism which is Kendo dash widget name. We also support K dash as well, which you can use. You can specify options within the markup as well. So if you want to go with a declarative sort of format, you can do that as well. So you remember that JavaScript array I showed you earlier? So down here we had a way of this is basically our configuration options for the grid. Right? You can do this in an object literal in JavaScript, but if you want, you can also initialize these using just simple attribute value pairs in the markup. So what these are delimiting are basically like minimum value, maximum value, what text you want to use for an up arrow. This is for a numeric text box, which is a text control, but with these two little up and down arrows on the right-hand side. So that's how you can drive that plumbing. But the same way in which you declare, it's the same exact way in which you declare your dependencies and your controller for defining scope. So that's how you go about that. So you can set specific options. This is the rule that I showed you earlier, or rather the usage rule, if you will, of defining those options in another example. So in this option here, what we can do is we can define values in scope, like text up and text down, and pull those out directly within the key value or the attribute value pairs. Here's another way of defining it. So here we're defining an editor, and then we're specifying our menu options. This is derived from what's called a K-tools attribute. So these menu options are things like give me a bold button, give me an italic button, give me an underline button, etc. So you can define those inline if you want, but you can also do it within JavaScript as well. So you can define it within the controller. So here, this is an example of using a date time picker. And then here we have this options literal called month picker config. This is the way that you will traditionally do it with Kendo UI proper. So you'll just define within JavaScript the config options. This is how you'll do it with Angular. So inside your scope, you'll say, give me the start of the date time picker is a year declaration. I can only go down to a year declaration, and then the format of that year will be a full text day, month plus its full year representation. Is this kind of making sense? Okay. I could go on and on. There's lots of ways of actually getting this stuff integrated. When you see things like this, kendo.toString or kendo.other aspects in JavaScript, these are aspects of the framework that we have defined for Kendo UI. So one of the aspects of the framework that we have defined for Kendo UI is the data source. I showed you a little bit about that earlier. We also have some basic functions as well that you can use for doing conversions or for doing validations or things of that nature. So we ship those as part of the framework, and those are documented as well. So that's, if you're in case wondering where does this come from, what is this doing, that's what this is doing. We have a bunch of string conversion functions. So in this case, we're converting a string into a currency type, which is denoted like that. You'll typically see this in .NET, but you won't see this in a lot of JavaScript frameworks unless you use a dependency. And remember, we're trying to eliminate dependencies, so that's why we include them. Okay. I know I'm going fast, but this will just help. So these are the following widgets that support template directives. We do have full support for this as well. But you can see we have a bunch of controls. And as you go through these, you'll see them. The ones that are derived, or sorry, rather prefixed with this name mobile are mobile controls. So Kendo UI is broken up into 3 main collections: web, data, data viz, and mobile. And mobile is a bunch of mobile-friendly controls. They can be used in the context of a web page, but they're mainly used within the confines of a hybrid app, which we'll take a look at. The ones that aren't prefixed with that sort of mobile delimiter, if you will, these are the sort of full-featured web controls that we have. Any questions on that so far?
Sorry, so you would need to know which browser the user is using. So if it's a tablet or a desktop, then you would need to have a template with one of the controls. But if it's a mobile, then you need to have a separate template using the mobile control grid.
So for that, that's adaptive rendering, and we have a couple of widgets that support that out of the box. There's an adaptive rendering for the grid and for the scheduler, and what that does is it makes sort of buttons bigger and allows more flexibility in the overall rendered output. One of the things I'll show you is we have a user voice site. I show this just to give you some side notes. We get a lot of feedback from the community, and this is a big piece of feedback we get from the community, which is I want my controls to adapt more easily to mobile browsers. In some cases, it makes total sense. Like the grid and the scheduler makes total sense, and I can show you what they look like when they render differently. Like buttons look bigger, and they're a little bit more flexible. For other controls like autocomplete control, it's really hard to figure out like how do you change the look and feel of an autocomplete control to adapt to a mobile setting, for example, because it's just a drop down, and so it can get a little tricky in that way. In certain cases, you know, it's one of those things where if you feel like you have to adapt the rendering yourself, you can, and certainly there are ways of which you can do that. We find that most customers like the fact that they can do that with the scheduler and the grid. For other controls, it's not a big deal, like the date time picker, for example. In other instances, we support what are called HTML5 form input types, which if you haven't seen, you can specify an input type beyond just text, right? You can say it's like a date or a time. And what will happen is in the browser of the phone, the phone's browser, it will actually recognize that data type and say, aha, I know that's a date time, and I'll provide you a native sort of picker that will integrate, and we support that, obviously, for that purpose. So we adjust based on those requirements. One of the things we have gotten a lot of feedback on is adaptive rendering. So if I do a quick search here on the user voice site here, you can see we've got some requests for adaptive rendering, some of which we've completed, some of which we are currently reviewing. Some of these aren't necessarily UX related, but yeah, definitely some things to look at. Just jumping back here to the grid itself, and again, I apologize for the res. It's kind of hard to get into what it looks like with such a tight resolution. I think I'm at 800 by 600 here. So if you go and take a look at this, where is adaptive rendering here? It's near the bottom. There we go. So there's a value you can specify for adaptive rendering of the grid. So you'll notice here, that's the same grid that we were looking at before, but now it's in the confines of a phone. And you can see that things look a little bit different. Like, for example, we don't have as many columns as we did before. We have this hamburger sort of icon as opposed to that sort of checkbox icon that you saw previously. So that's this kind of adaptive rendering that we support in some of our controls. It's kind of difficult because sometimes people would look at that and like, oh, I don't want a hamburger icon. I want this or that. And it's really hard to predict some of those things. So that's kind of the reasons why, you know, like you can go down the roll your own route, which you're implying. In other cases, you can just use whatever comes out of the box, and we try and do our best to make it look well on a mobile device. The way in which you'll get that running, by the way, it turns out to be pretty simple. Down here in the configuration, you'll just specify this option that says mobile:phone. And what that does is it basically says use the mobile sort of design and layout of the grid control for that purpose. You can certainly query aspects of the user agent and also detect certain other aspects of the user agent itself, like the viewport, which we have support for within the framework. So these are some of the things we've added support for. So what we're doing here is if the height of the viewport, or if this is, I think this is what this is asking, is if the mobile OS is Windows Phone, then specify the height to be 24 ems. Otherwise, use 430 pixels. That's all that sort of fiddling you'll have to do with a lot of our controls. Of course, you don't have to do it with this. You can use it through CSS, which is what we've done. Everything that we've done can adapt through CSS. We have all those controls. They target various CSS rules that we have defined. In fact, if you want to take a look at that, you can see it through what's called our theme builder. So if you scroll down here, we have this thing called a theme builder. You can change the look and feel of all the controls very easily. So on this page, you'll see a bunch of controls. So we have our grid, we have our menu, we have our date picker. This is all using the built-in material design theme. There's our color picker. And you can change the look and feel of these by simply either selecting a theme. So go from material to black. So you get that sort of retro late 90s sort of gradient black stuff, which is awesome. You can change it to something else like Bootstrap, which is very popular. So here's the Bootstrap sort of theme. If you want, you can roll your own. So we have this bookmarklet you can use, which is the theme builder. And this allows you to target all those CSS rules that we have predefined within our style sheets. So here we can just say, you know, I want to target a widget, and I want the background color of every widget to be red because it's Valentine's Day, and I feel lucky, or whatever, I don't know. So you can see how that gets generated. From there, you can generate the CSS, and you can see these are all the CSS rules that we've defined. If you're looking for them in the style sheets themselves, they're just k-prefixed. So to prevent name collisions in our rules, we just prefix them with k-. That seems to work pretty well. If you're into less and preprocessors and things like that and variables, you can use the less generation as well. So that's how that works. So you can certainly roll your own design if you wish. You can certainly change the look and feel of these if you wish. But using it with Angular turns out to be pretty simple. That being said, we do have a number of integration points with Kendo UI. We have what's called our Labs project, and we have a lot of community contributions that have been made to integrate Kendo UI with other sort of frameworks. So we mentioned Angular, which is officially supported. We have integration with, we support Bootstrap, for example. We support other ones like Knockout, which is maintained by other folks. And people can submit their projects directly here. This is doing an API call in the back to get that list of projects. It's just taking a little time here, so I'll just show you what the GitHub project looks like. So there's our Knockout bindings. Polymer, if you're using Polymer, which is Google's custom elements project with using polyfills and things like that, that's something that we've looked at. We have a linter, which is a static analysis tool, so you can see, am I making any errors in my configs, that sort of thing. Backbone's another one. This is one that I've used in the past. We have other ones like Rails. Breeze is another one. We have some Yeoman generators as well, which I'll talk about in our third session. We have Angular, obviously, as well. So there's a lot of ways in which you can play nicely with others, and that's our intention. We're trying to integrate with as many frameworks as possible. So just to recap or review, apologies again for the res. It's kind of hard to see all these things. But Kendo UI is comprised of 70 different widgets, or over 70 different widgets, basically falling into one of three categories: mobile, web, and data viz. We'll talk about data viz later. But essentially, they are easy to initialize, easy to use in vanilla sort of terms, but they do integrate well in Angular. And they are done through a set of custom directives and bindings that we've defined. And you can easily utilize and target those bindings and directives within your projects themselves. If you want to find examples of that, you can go to our demos page, which is listed here. At the bottom of pretty much every demo, there's an AngularJS demo where we show you how just by changing those bindings, you get all the niceties of Angular, like with MVVM and things like with models and updated bindings and things like that. You can see how those things are configured. We can see how you will go ahead and initialize these objects very easily. And that's essentially how that works. pretty simple to understand, not terribly complicated, but effective if you're targeting Kendo plus Angular, which I assume you guys are. Cool. Any questions before I wrap up?
The difference here, I noticed that they had a little pro link.
Yes. So the question is, there's a difference on the left-hand side here. There's things that are marked here as pro and ones that aren't. The ones that are marked as pro are our pay-for components. So we have basically a suite that you pay for, which is our Kendo UI Professional suite. And then the ones that aren't marked are available as part of Kendo UI Core, but they're also part of Pro as well. And those ones you can download and use for free because they're open source. Yes, it is pretty sweet. Yeah, so there's just a handful of pro components. The big ones like the Gantt chart and the scheduler are pro components because they're pretty beefy and big. Also our grid and pivot grid, etc. All of our data viz aspects are pro components as well. But conversely, all of our mobile widgets are all open source. So all of our Kendo UI mobile widgets / controls are open source, which you can use. So all good. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks a lot, and we'll go ahead and wrap up this session, and then in our next session, we'll take a look at Kendo UI data viz and other aspects. Thanks.
Did you get all that? We'll take the SSW TV quiz and test your knowledge now.